The courtroom was packed, all eyes fixed on the 94-year-old man standing at the defendant's table. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, not in his acting role, but this time defending himself against the legal system. A simple property dispute or an unexpected battle? Judge Bridger smirked, mocking his decision to represent himself. Reporters scribbled notes, sneers spreading across the courtroom. They thought it would be a farce. But within minutes, the entire courtroom was silenced. What happened next left everyone breathless. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Comment with your city's name and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, another inspiring story awaits. The story begins. The Monterey County courtroom was abuzz with anticipation. This wasn't just any legal proceeding. It was Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon, standing at the plaintiff's table. People whispered, nudged their neighbors, and discreetly glanced at their phones to capture the moment. Outside, news vans lined the streets, satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to beam any juicy developments to the world. Clint Eastwood had faced villains on screen for over 6 decades, but today, his adversary wasn't a gunslinger or a corrupt sheriff, but the legal system itself. The lawsuit he filed was a straightforward property dispute. A real estate developer, Gerald Sterling, had encroached on Clint's land in Carmel by the sea, building part of a luxury condominium complex on land that didn't belong to him. Eastwood had tried to resolve the matter civilly, through letters, calls, and formal complaints, but his warnings were ignored. Now he was in court, ready to defend himself. The tension was palpable as Judge Jefferson Bridger finally entered the room. A portly man in his 60s, Judge Bridger had sat on the bench for decades and seen all sorts of cases, but this was a novelty. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the now plaintiff. Movie star, a smirk playing on his lips. Mr. Eastwood, he began, tapping his gavel. I understand you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter. Clint, standing ramrod straight despite his 94 years, simply nodded, his blue eyes as sharp as ever, locking onto the judges. That is correct. A ripple of chuckles spread through the courtroom, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others grinning, anticipating what they assumed would be a train wreck. Even Sterling, sitting at the defendant's table with his high-powered attorney, let out a small laugh. Judge Bridger leaned forward. Do you understand that legal proceedings are not like a Hollywood script? There are rules, procedures. It's not as simple as delivering a monologue and riding off into the sunset. The laughter grew louder, reporters scribbling furiously, one even whispering, "This is gold." But Clint didn't react. He let the laughter subside, waited for the room to quiet. Then in a calm, measured voice, he said, I know the rules, Your Honor, and I know the law. Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow. Oh, and where did you study law, Mr. Eastwood? The courtroom's chuckles erupted into full-blown laughter. But Eastwood, ever patient, simply reached into his briefcase, pulling out a neatly bound stack of documents. He placed them on the table before him, tapping the first page gently with his finger. I've spent the past 6 months reviewing every property law that applies to this case. I've read the local zoning ordinances, I've studied the precedents, and I have ample evidence to prove that my land was illegally encroached upon. His voice remained steady, unwavering. I'm here now to present that evidence. If this court is about justice, then let's begin. The laughter ceased. For the first time, the courtroom began to realize something. Clint Eastwood wasn't here to perform. He was here to win. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the weight of his earlier mockery. Very well, Mr. Eastwood. Let's proceed. Clint took his seat, his expression unreadable, but as the crowd's murmurs died down and the trial officially began, there was an undeniable truth hanging in the air. This was no ordinary case, and Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man. Judge Jefferson Bridger readjusted his robes and glanced at Clint Eastwood, still slightly amused by the actor's decision to represent himself. He had expected Eastwood to stammer and stumble through the legal jargon, grasping at straws in a courtroom not designed for movie stars. But something about the way Clint sat, calm, composed, and utterly unfazed, gave the judge pause. "Mr. Eastwood, you may begin with your opening statement," Judge Bridger said, leaning back in his chair, expecting a clumsy, half-baked monologue. Clint rose slowly, placing his hands lightly on the table before him. He didn't rush. He let the silence hang, a trick he'd mastered in countless films. The weight of his presence compelled the room to quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, deep, and deliberate. "In 1992, I purchased a piece of land in Carmel. By the sea," he began, his eyes fixed on the judge. "The property lines were clearly documented. Over the years, I've maintained that land, paid the taxes, and ensured it was kept in accordance with local regulations. But last year, Mr. Sterling and his company decided that my property was no longer mine. He withdrew a set of documents from his briefcase, placing them on the table with precision. Sterling's company built on my land without my consent. They ignored the boundaries, they ignored the permits, they ignored me. I sent formal warnings, legal notices, and cease and desist orders. They ignored those too." The courtroom, once filled with snickers and jeers, was silent. Onlookers, journalists, even Sterling's legal team were all listening intently. Clint continued, pulling out aerial photographs taken over time. "These images show the land before and after the construction began. This is my property line," he pointed to markings on the images, "and this," he slid another photo forward, showing the gradual encroachment of the construction onto his land, "is Sterling's construction." Gerald Sterling's attorney, Gerald Davies, cleared his throat and stood. A tall, slender man in a designer suit, he exuded the confidence of a corporate lawyer, used to steamrolling cases like this. "Your Honor, if I may." Clint raised a hand without looking at him. "I'm not finished." The abrupt interruption was so unexpected that Davies froze, blinking. The judge hesitated, then nodded for Clint to continue. Eastwood reached into his stack of documents and pulled out copies of emails and letters between his legal representatives and Sterling's company. "This is a record of every attempt I made to resolve this matter before bringing it to court." He looked up at Sterling. "They had every opportunity to do the right thing. They chose not to." Davies scoffed, regaining his composure. "Your Honor, if I may address this issue." Judge Bridger nodded, and Davies turned to Clint with a smirk. "Mr. Eastwood, you've certainly done your homework, and I commend the effort. But with all due respect, you're not a lawyer. These legal matters are complex. You're presenting evidence. Sure, but do you understand the nuances of property law?" Clint leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Davies. "I understand the law perfectly well, and I understand when someone breaks it." Davies chuckled, shaking his head. "You think this is like one of your movies, don't you? A lone man standing up against the system." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally object to this entire charade. This case deserves a proper trial, not a performance." Judge Bridger looked at Clint. "Any response, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint nodded. "Yeah, you want a performance, go see one of my movies. This," he gestured around the courtroom, "is real, and I take real seriously." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. He had expected a show, but instead, he was seeing something entirely different. A man who had spent a lifetime portraying justice on screen, now demanding it in real life. "Very well," Bridger said finally, "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed." Clint sat down, his face unreadable, but he could feel the shift in the room. They weren't laughing anymore. Judge Jefferson Bridger leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as he processed what had just transpired in his courtroom. When Clint Eastwood had first announced that he would be representing himself, Bridger had been certain that this case would be nothing more than an amusing spectacle, a Hollywood legend fumbling through legal procedures he didn't understand. But now, just minutes into the trial, that assumption was crumbling. The courtroom, once alive with snickers and whispers, was now eerily silent. The laughter had vanished as quickly as it had begun, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. Eastwood wasn't here to play cowboy. He wasn't reciting lines or putting on an act. He was a man who had spent decades studying the art of justice, both on film and in life, and he was presenting his case with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Judge Bridger leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his tone more measured now you've presented your argument. "Mr. Davies, would you care to respond?" Gerald Davies, the slick corporate lawyer representing Gerald Sterling, smirked as he rose. He was unfazed, at least for now. "Your Honor, while I appreciate Mr. Eastwood's confidence, this case is a bit more complex than he's making it out to be." He turned to face the courtroom, exuding the ease of a man accustomed to winning. "What we have here is a simple misunderstanding of property lines. Now, I understand Mr. Eastwood believes his land was encroached upon, but we have ample documentation to prove otherwise." He gestured to his own stack of legal papers, neatly bound in expensive leather folders. "Mr. Eastwood has done a fine job of assembling his case, but I must remind the court that practicing law isn't as simple as reading a few law books. Law is about interpretation, precedent, and most importantly, expertise. And with all due respect, Mr. Eastwood is not an expert." He turned to Clint, smiling condescendingly. "Now, Mr. Eastwood, I understand you've played cops and detectives throughout your career, and I must admit I've enjoyed some of your films." He chuckled lightly. "But this isn't Dirty Harry, and it's certainly not Unforgiven. This is real life, and in real life you can't just shoot your way out of a legal dispute." The courtroom laughed again, though this time it was more strained, an attempt by Davies to regain control of the room. Clint, seated at his table, didn't laugh, didn't blink. He simply rearranged the papers in front of him, methodical as always. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate. "You're right," Clint said, his tone measured. "This isn't a movie." He rose slowly, placing both hands on the table. "And I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Davies." The laughter stopped. Clint picked up a stack of legal documents and began flipping through them. "You want to talk about expertise? Let's talk about facts." He pulled out a large aerial photograph of his property before the construction began. "This is my land in 2021. My boundaries are here." He pointed to clearly marked and legally recorded property lines. "This is my land in 2023. You see," he pointed to the area where Sterling's construction had extended over the boundary line. "That's your client's building on my property." Davies shifted slightly, but Clint wasn't finished. He pulled out an email printout. "This is the cease and desist order I sent to Sterling's company when the construction first began to encroach on my property line." No response. He flipped to another page. "This is the second notice." No response. He flipped to a third page. "This is the third notice." He looked up, staring at Davies. "Do you see a pattern here?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, property disputes are rarely this clear-cut. There are complexities in the law that—" Clint raised a hand, cutting him off. "You ignored the law until you got caught." The room was silent. Even Judge Bridger seemed taken aback. He'd seen plenty of people represent themselves, but none had ever presented themselves with the unwavering confidence of Clint Eastwood. He wasn't flustered, he wasn't unsure, he was methodical, precise, and above all, correct. Davies forced a smile, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, I think we're getting a bit carried away here. This is still just an opening argument, and while Mr. Eastwood certainly knows how to command a room, we're dealing with technical legal matters here." Judge Bridger, who had initially viewed this case as a novelty, wasn't so sure anymore. He steepled his fingers, glancing between Davies and Eastwood. For the first time, he felt a twinge of regret for underestimating the man standing before him. "Very well," the judge said. "Mr. Davies, you'll have your chance to present your defense soon enough. But for now, I'd like to continue hearing from Mr. Eastwood." Clint nodded slightly and sat down, his face unreadable. But even as Davies took his seat, shifting uncomfortably, one thing had become clear. The judge had made a mistake in underestimating Clint Eastwood, and he wasn't the only one. By the time the trial recessed for the day, the story had spread like wildfire. News crews camped outside the Monterey County Courthouse, their cameras rolling as reporters delivered breathless updates. The headlines practically wrote themselves. "Clint Eastwood takes on the legal system and wins round one. Let my case play out. Hollywood icon stuns courtroom. Judge underestimates Eastwood. now regrets it. Social media exploded. Clips from inside the courtroom, some illegally shot by eager onlookers, went viral online, showing Eastwood presenting his evidence while his opponent fumbled. Legal analysts debated the case on television, some amused, others impressed. Look, nobody expected Clint Eastwood to walk in and actually know the law, one analyst remarked on a national news program, but the man has clearly done his homework. He's disciplined, precise, and frankly, he commands that courtroom better than some lawyers I've seen. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as soon as Eastwood stepped through the doors. Mr. Eastwood, did you expect to make such a strong impression? He adjusted his hat and gave a slight shrug. I just came to tell the truth. Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer? Another reporter asked. Clint paused, turning to face the cameras. Justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is, he said. It's about what's right. Then he walked to his car, ignoring the flashing lights. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Reporters filled the gallery, eager to see if Eastwood's momentum would continue, or if the defense would finally corner him. Sterling's lawyer, Gerald Davies, was no longer playing nice. He straightened his tie and approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to make a motion, he said smoothly. Given the media frenzy surrounding this case, I believe it's imperative that we operate within a strict legal capacity. I move that Mr. Eastwood be required to either retain counsel or withdraw his claim. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Bridger glanced at Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, any response? Clint rose, placing his hands lightly on the table. I do, he said, his voice steady. This is a public court. The public is watching, sure, but the media didn't put Sterling's building on my land. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters, and the media certainly didn't file this lawsuit. I did. He looked directly at Davies. You want me to hire a lawyer because I'm making you nervous? Davies gave a strained smile. Not at all. I'm simply stating that the legal process is complex. Even seasoned attorneys struggle with it. Clint nodded. I imagine they do. He picked up his file and pulled out another document. But as far as I know, the Constitution doesn't say I need a lawyer to defend my own property. Unless you think a man can't stand up for himself anymore. The murmuring in the room grew louder. Judge Bridger cleared his throat. Mr. Davies, while I understand your concerns, Mr. Eastwood is well within his rights to represent himself. Davies gritted his teeth, realizing he'd just lost another round. As the morning session continued, Clint called his first witness, Samuel Reynolds, a retired land surveyor who had worked in Monterey County for over 30 years. He had personally surveyed Clint's property multiple times. Mr. Reynolds, Clint said, approaching the witness stand, you've reviewed my property records and land surveys, correct? Yes, sir, Reynolds replied. I've worked with Mr. Eastwood for decades. His property lines have remained unchanged since the early 90s. Clint nodded and held up a document. Can you confirm that this is the original deed? Reynolds glanced at it and nodded. Yes, this clearly states that the land in question belongs to Mr. Eastwood. Clint turned to the jury. That's the law right there, plain as day. Davies shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is not qualified to interpret legal documents before the jury. Judge Bridger hesitated, but finally sighed. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, keep your line of questioning within proper legal bounds. Clint nodded. All right, let's keep it simple. He turned back to Reynolds. Has there ever been a legal dispute over my property lines before? No, Reynolds said firmly. Clint turned back to the judge. No further questions. Davies stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He strode towards Reynolds, flashing a confident smile. Mr. Reynolds, you've been a land surveyor for a long time, haven't you? 35 years, Reynolds confirmed. And in that time, have you ever seen a case where property lines were misinterpreted? Maybe not intentionally, but mistakes happen, don't they? Reynolds shifted slightly. Sometimes, but not in this case. The lines are clear. Davies nodded. That's your opinion. Clint leaned back in his chair, watching, as Davies tried to poke holes in testimony that simply didn't have any. After a few more failed attempts to undermine the witness, Davy sighed. No further questions. The system wasn't ready. As the day's session ended, Judge Bridger once again found himself studying Clint Eastwood. The courtroom had been against him from the start. No formal legal training, no high-powered law firm backing him, but none of that had stopped him from taking control of the case. Bridger had thought this would be another case of a self-represented party stumbling through procedures, making a mess before ultimately losing. But Clint wasn't losing. He was winning. And as the gavel fell, Bridger realized something else. Hollywood might have taught Clint Eastwood how to deliver justice on screen, but in real life, the system wasn't ready for him. By the time Clint Eastwood called Gerald Sterling to the witness stand, the courtroom had settled into an eerie tension. No one was laughing anymore. The air crackled with the realization that Eastwood wasn't just holding his ground. He was advancing, unflinching, relentless. Sterling, a wealthy real estate developer in his mid-50s, took the stand with the same air of arrogance that had earned him millions in the cutthroat world of high-end property development. Sterling, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, adjusted his tie before sitting down. His lawyer, Gerald Davies, stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, let's clarify something for the court. Do you believe your company acted within legal bounds in its construction efforts? Sterling nodded smoothly. Absolutely. We conducted a full legal review before starting the project. Davies smiled. So, in your professional opinion, is it possible that Mr. Eastwood is simply mistaken about his own property lines? I think that's a reasonable assumption, Sterling replied, a slight smirk on his lips. The courtroom murmured. Clint sat at his table, arms crossed, watching, waiting. No further questions, Davies said, stepping back. Your witness, Mr. Eastwood. A hush fell over the courtroom as Clint slowly rose from his chair. He didn't carry papers, didn't even glance at his notes. He simply walked towards the witness stand with the quiet confidence he'd carried for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. Mr. Sterling, he said, you just testified that you believe I'm mistaken about my own land. Sterling smirked again. That's correct. Clint nodded slightly, then walked to the evidence table, where the aerial photos were neatly arranged. He picked up the first one, the one showing the untouched land before construction began, and held it up. Do you recognize this? Sterling barely glanced at it. Looks like an aerial shot of some property. Clint's eyes narrowed. Not some property, my property, taken before your company started building. Sterling shrugged. If you say so. Clint remained unfazed. He reached for another photo, this one taken after construction had begun. It showed the skeleton of the luxury condos encroaching on the property line. How about this one? Clint asked, stepping closer. Sterling shifted slightly in his seat. I assume that's from our development project. Clint nodded again, placing the two photos side by side. And can you explain why part of your development project is on my land? Sterling sighed through his nose, clearly annoyed. Mr. Eastwood, property disputes happen all the time. Boundary lines get fuzzy. It's a complicated business. Clint took a step closer. Fuzzy, his voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it. He turned to face the jury. Boundary lines don't get fuzzy by accident. They get ignored. Clint carefully placed the photos down and picked up a document. His formal cease and desist letter, sent to Sterling's company months before the lawsuit. Did you receive this letter? Sterling hesitated, then sighed. I'm sure our legal team handled it. That's not what I asked, Clint replied evenly. Did you personally receive this letter? Sterling shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I suppose I did. Clint turned to the jury again. And after receiving this letter, after I made it clear that you were building on land that wasn't yours, did you stop construction? Sterling's jaw tightened. Clint let the silence hang. Finally, Sterling cleared his throat. No, he admitted. Another murmur ran through the courtroom. Clint didn't react, didn't push. He let the jury absorb the answer fully. After a long pause, he simply said, no further questions. As Clint walked back to his seat, he caught the expressions of the jury members. Initially skeptical, some even amused, they were now leaning forward, their faces serious. Judge Bridger rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. He had underestimated Eastwood. Sterling's lawyer had underestimated him. Everyone had underestimated him. And now, piece by piece, Clint was dismantling the defense's case. Davies stood, visibly flustered, buttoning his suit jacket and approaching Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice less smooth than before, to clarify, "at the time the construction began, did you understand that you were acting within your legal rights?" Sterling adjusted his tie. "Yes." "And did you intentionally, willfully violate property law?" Sterling shook his head. "No. Any misunderstanding of property lines was just that, a misunderstanding." Davies nodded, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is a businessman. He operates within the legal framework to the best of his ability. There was never any intent to break the law, and any errors made were purely incidental." Clint leaned back in his chair, watching. He had made his point, no need for further objections. Judge Bridger sighed. "We'll resume proceedings after a short recess." He tapped his gavel, and the courtroom erupted with chatter as Clint rose to stretch. A reporter in the gallery whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just a property case anymore. It's Clint Eastwood versus corporate America." Another reporter nodded. "And he's winning." Meanwhile, at the defense table, Davies leaned close to Sterling's. "Here, we need to reconsider our strategy," he muttered. "If we don't stop him soon, this case is going to spiral completely out of control." Sterling frowned, his confidence cracking. "Do whatever you need to do." Across the courtroom, Clint sat down, calm as ever. He wasn't worried, he wasn't flustered, because he knew one thing. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to play dirty. You just let the truth speak for itself. By the time the trial reconvened, the tension in the room had shifted. The arrogant confidence with which Gerald Davies had entered that morning had begun to fray. Gerald Sterling, the real estate magnate who had initially dismissed Clint Eastwood as nothing more than an aging actor playing courtroom drama, now sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched. Clint, on the other hand, remained as composed as ever. He sat at his table, arms folded, his demeanor unchanged. While the defense strategized in hushed tones, he simply observed, calm, patient, unfazed. Judge Jefferson Bridger rubbed his temples before turning his attention to Davies. "Mr. Davies, you may proceed with your next witness." Davies stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and turned to the courtroom. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls Robert Whitaker, a senior land appraiser, to the stand." A balding man in his early 60s took the stand, his expression neutral as he was sworn in. Davies straightened his tie and stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, you've been a land appraiser for over 35 years, correct?" "Yes, sir," Whitaker replied. "And in that time, have you encountered cases where property disputes arose from outdated surveys or inaccurate boundary markers?" "Certainly," Whitaker said, nodding. "It happens more often than people think. Even legally recorded boundaries can sometimes have minor discrepancies. Adjustments are made based on updated surveys." Davies turned to the jury, gesturing subtly as if guiding them to his conclusion. "Would you say it's possible that Mr. Eastwood's claim, while perhaps understandable, could be based on an outdated interpretation of his property's true legal boundaries?" Whitaker hesitated. "I'd say it's possible," he conceded. Davies smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, no further questions." He stepped back confidently, his posture straighter than it had been since the trial began. It seemed he had scored a point for the defense, but Clint Eastwood was already rising from his seat. He approached the witness stand with a slow, deliberate pace, his boots tapping softly on the polished wood floor. Reaching the stand, he placed his hands on the railing before him, locking eyes with Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said evenly, "how often would you say developers like Mr. Sterling try to push past legal property lines?" Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me? You've been a land appraiser for 35 years, Clint continued. "In that time, how often have you seen developers intentionally build over property lines?" Assuming the other party won't fight back, Whitaker hesitated. He glanced at Sterling, then at Davies before clearing his throat. "I couldn't say for sure," Clint nodded. Let me help you. He pulled out a document and placed it on the witness stand. These are records of past property disputes involving Sterling Development Corporation. Would you care to read the number of times they've been accused of violating boundary lines? Whitaker picked up the document and adjusted his glasses. His eyes scanned the page, and his face tightened slightly. There are 5 recorded disputes. Clint raised an eyebrow. 5. And how many of those were settled out of court? Whitaker swallowed. All of them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint turned to the jury. So, we're not talking about an innocent misunderstanding here. We're talking about a pattern. A man who's been caught before and paid his way out every time. Davies shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant. Past disputes have no bearing on this case. Judge Bridger sighed. He had to admit that Eastwood was making a compelling argument. Overruled. Mr. Eastwood, please keep your questions focused on the case at hand. Clint nodded. He turned back to Whitaker. One more question. Did you personally review the official survey of my land? Whitaker hesitated. No, not personally. Clint nodded again and turned to the judge. No further questions. As he walked back to his table, Davies looked visibly frustrated. His own witness had just admitted that he hadn't even reviewed key evidence. Davies took a deep breath and approached Sterling, who was whispering angrily. This is a joke, Sterling muttered. I'm paying you to win, not to let some cowboy make us look like fools. Davies gritted his teeth, hissing back. Calm down. He's landed a few good punches, but we're still ahead. Sterling narrowed his eyes. Are we? Davies didn't reply, instead turning back to the judge. Your Honor, at this time we'd like to present our closing argument. Judge Bridger gave a slow sigh, nodding. Very well, Mr. Davies, you may begin. Davies adjusted his jacket and turned to the jury, launching into a carefully rehearsed monologue. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've all been entertained these past few days. We've seen Mr. Eastwood put on quite a show. But let's be clear, justice isn't about movies. It's not about drama or emotions. It's about the law, and the law is not on Mr. Eastwood's side. He gestured towards the courtroom. We live in a complex world. Property law, boundary disputes, legal interpretations. These things require expertise, and while Mr. Eastwood has presented a passionate case, passion alone doesn't prove legal ownership. Davies nodded confidently. My client followed the necessary steps to begin construction. Any claims otherwise are a misunderstanding, not malice. And while we respect Mr. Eastwood's commitment to this case, we urge you to focus on the facts, not the spectacle. With that, he turned and walked back to his table. Clint sat still for a long moment before rising. He walked towards the jury, moving slowly, deliberately. Then he spoke. He said, I've made a lot of movies over the years. He paused. But not one of them was about letting people get away with what they know is wrong. He turned to Sterling. Mr. Sterling knew what he was doing. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd take a settlement like all the others. He thought he could steal a piece of my land, turn it into luxury condos, and walk away richer. He let that hang in the air. You're here today because justice isn't about money. It's not about how expensive your lawyer is or how many suits you own. He looked at the jury, locking eyes with each of them. It's about doing what's right. He stepped back. And that's all I have to say. As he walked back to his seat, the weight of his words filled the room. Judge Bridger nodded solemnly. Court is adjourned until tomorrow, when the jury will deliver its verdict. And with that, the battle was almost over. The courtroom fell silent. The next morning, the buzz that had filled the room in the preceding days was replaced by tense anticipation. Today, the trial would take its most decisive turn. Judge Jefferson Bridger took his seat and adjusted his glasses, looking more serious than he had since the case began. Mr. Eastwood, do you have any further witnesses before we move to closing arguments? Clint Eastwood stood as firm as ever. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mr. Michael Ollie to the stand. The name was unfamiliar to most in the courtroom, but it immediately sent a ripple of unease through the defense table. Gerald Davies frowned, glancing at his client, Gerald Sterling, who looked equally perplexed. Who the hell is he? Sterling whispered. Davies shook his head. No idea. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A man in his early 50s walked in, wearing a workman's jacket and jeans, his boots scuffing the polished floor as he approached the stand. His face was tanned and lined from years of outdoor work. The court clerk swore him in, and once he was settled, Clint approached, his pace slow and deliberate. Mr. Ali, Clint began, his voice as steady as ever. Can you tell the court what you do for a living? Mr. Ali cleared his throat. I'm a construction foreman. Been in the business for over 20 years. And who have you been working for recently? Mr. Ali shifted slightly, glancing at Sterling before sighing. Sterling Development Corporation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Davies was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, I object. This witness was not disclosed to the defense. Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow at Clint. Mr. Eastwood? Clint nodded. Your Honor, Mr. Ali came forward voluntarily last night. He wasn't originally on my witness list, but after hearing the testimony so far, he had a realization. Clint turned to Mr. Ali. Tell the court what you realized. Mr. Ali swallowed, then looked directly at the judge. I realized I didn't want to be part of a cover-up. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. Order. Davies's face had turned pale. Sterling, meanwhile, sat as stiff as a man who'd seen a ghost. Clint folded his arms. Mr. Ali, to be clear, you're saying there's a cover-up? Mr. Ali nodded. Yes, sir. Clint walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. These are the original blueprints and construction plans submitted to the city for Sterling's development project. Can you confirm these are the accurate documents? Mr. Ali took the folder, flipping through the pages. After a moment, he nodded. Yes, these are the official plans. Clint leaned forward slightly. And was there ever a second set of plans? Mr. Ali hesitated, glancing at Sterling. The real estate mogul's face was flushed with anger. Finally, Mr. Ali sighed. Yes, he said, there was a second set of plans. They weren't officially filed, but they included revisions, changes to push the property lines out further. The murmuring from the crowd grew louder. Davies shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. We have no evidence of this so-called second set of plans. Judge Bridger turned to Mr. Ali. Do you have evidence of these revised plans? Mr. Ali reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB flash drive. Yes, Your Honor, I backed up all the project files before construction began. These documents show two different versions of the same project, one legal, one not. Davies looked like he wanted to crawl under the floor. Sterling, on the other hand, was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. Judge Bridger motioned to the bailiff, who took the flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. Let's get this examined immediately, Bridger said, before turning back to Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, are you saying Mr. Sterling was fully aware his project was encroaching on Mr. Eastwood's land? Mr. Ali hesitated, but then nodded. Yes, he knew. We all did. We were told to keep quiet about it. Clint turned to the jury, letting those words sink in. Then he looked back at Mr. Ali. Why are you telling the truth now? Mr. Ali sighed, looking down at his hands. Because I've been watching this trial. I saw you standing there alone, just trying to get justice, and I realized that's the kind of man I should be. A moment of silence passed before Clint nodded slightly. No further questions. Judge Bridger turned to Davies. Mr. Davies, do you wish to cross-examine? Davies looked at Sterling, then back at the judge. He hesitated for a long moment before sighing. No, Your Honor. Judge Bridger nodded. Very well, we'll take a short recess before proceeding. He banged his gavel, and the courtroom instantly erupted in chatter. As Clint walked back to his seat, Davies and Sterling were whispering angrily at the defense table. What the hell just happened? Sterling hissed. You said we had this under control. Davies rubbed his face. That was before your own foreman turned on us. He sighed. We're in trouble, Gerald. Across the room, Clint sat back in his chair, watching them. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't gloating, he was just waiting, because he knew what was coming next. and so did Sterling. For the first time since the trial began, the defense knew they were going to lose. The tension in the Monterey County courtroom was palpable as the judge called for recess. Onlookers filed out, buzzing with whispered speculations. Reporters scrambled for their phones, typing furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. Star witness turns, Clint Eastwood's case takes stunning twist. Sterling development conspiracy exposed in court. Eastwood's one-man fight for justice gains ground. Inside the courthouse, Clint Eastwood remained seated at his table, unfazed by the media frenzy outside. He had spent a lifetime playing characters who could take down any adversary, and today was no different. He sipped his water, occasionally glancing at Gerald Sterling, who was locked in an angry conversation with his lawyer, Gerald Davies. Sterling's face was flushed with rage. "Fix this," he hissed. "We can't lose this case." Davies sighed, rubbing his temples. "We may not have a choice, Gerald." When the court reconvened, the jurors filed in, their expressions serious. The gravity of what had just transpired was clear. A key witness, Sterling's own construction foreman, had revealed damning evidence of intentional encroachment. And now, with the newly submitted digital records to review, the truth was becoming impossible to hide. Judge Jefferson Bridger leaned forward, his voice carrying more weight than before. "Court is back in session. Mr. Davies, with the new evidence presented, do you have any motions before we proceed?" Davies stood, adjusting his tie as if trying to regain some semblance of control. Clint sat back, arms folded. He had been expecting this move. "Your Honor, the defense would like to request a continuance to review the files presented by Mr. Ali." Judge Bridger shook his head. "Motion denied. The defense has had ample time to provide a full and truthful record of their property lines. Instead, it took a whistleblower to bring the truth to this court." His eyes sharpened as he looked at Davies. "We are proceeding with closing arguments." Davies swallowed hard as the jury sat rapt. Davies stepped forward, visibly flustered, but still trying to salvage his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice less smooth than his confidence had been throughout the trial. "You've been presented with compelling arguments from both sides. You've seen the evidence, you've heard the testimony, and yes, you've even witnessed unexpected moments of drama." He glanced at Clint as if implying the actor had staged it all for effect. "But let me remind you, this isn't a Hollywood production," Davies continued. "This is a legal proceeding, and the law requires us to look at facts, not emotions. The fact is, property disputes happen, misunderstandings happen, boundaries shift, records get confused." Clint slowly shook his head. He didn't have to say it, the jury could see right through it. Davies cleared his throat and continued. "Yes, my client's company may have made errors in their plan submissions, but that doesn't equate to criminal intent. Mr. Sterling is a respected businessman who has brought economic development to this area. To paint him as some kind of villain is a gross oversimplification." Davies turned to the jury, flashing his most professional smile. "I urge you to consider the big picture, to see this case for what it is, a land disagreement, not a willful act of wrongdoing." He gave a slight bow and stepped back to his seat. The room was silent as Clint rose. He didn't approach the jury box as Davies had, instead remaining by his chair, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I don't have a fancy speech," he said simply, "no theatrics, no legal tricks." He let his gaze sweep over the jurors, each of them holding their breath. "What I do have is a piece of land bought fair and square, a piece of land I worked to get, a piece of land that was stolen bit by bit because someone thought they could get away with it." His voice was low, calm, but each word cut through the silence like a blade. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was greed. He turned slightly, looking towards Sterling, whose face was dark with undisguised rage. He stepped forward slowly, moving closer to the jury. "You've seen the evidence, you've heard the truth from someone on the inside of Sterling's operation, and you've heard from his lawyer who wants you to believe it's all just a big mistake." Clint let the silence hang for a beat. "But you know better. That's all I have to say." He returned to his seat, the room still holding its breath. Judge Bridger looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have the case. Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict. He tapped his gavel as the jury filed out of the courtroom to deliberate. The tension was palpable. Reporters rushed out the door, ready to deliver the latest developments to the world. At the defense table, Sterling's expression had shifted from anger to something else. Fear. We should have settled, he muttered to Davies. Davies sighed. Yeah, we should have. Meanwhile, Clint sat quietly, his face unreadable. A younger man might have paced, might have fidgeted, might have let the weight of uncertainty get to him. But Clint Eastwood was patient. He'd played this scene before and he knew it. It was only a matter of time before the verdict came. The truth had been laid bare. Now it was just a matter of time. The jury deliberated for hours, and the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Clint Eastwood sat still, his arms folded, watching the clock tick by minute. His face remained expressionless, but his mind was racing, reviewing every detail of the case, every document, every photo, every moment that had led them here. On the other side of the room, Gerald Sterling grew increasingly agitated, his polished veneer beginning to crack. He checked his watch constantly, his eyes darting nervously towards the jury room door, as if he could somehow will them to return with a favorable verdict. Davies, his lawyer, sat beside him, frantically scribbling notes on a legal pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. He hadn't said much in the past hour, lost in the realization that the case was slipping from their grasp. The defense strategy had crumbled. Sterling's earlier arrogance seemed a distant memory, now replaced by a sinking sense of inevitability. Maybe they'll come back with a compromise, Sterling muttered, his voice strained, at least a smaller settlement. Davies didn't answer. He just kept scribbling, trying to construct something, anything that could salvage their side. But deep down, he knew it was over. Meanwhile, Clint remained calm. He didn't look at Sterling or Davies. He didn't even glance at the jury room. Instead, he simply waited. The truth was on his side, and he knew it. It wasn't a matter of if he'd won, but when. Just then, the jury room door opened, and the bailiff stepped out, signaling the courtroom to rise. Everyone stood in silence as the jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a composed demeanor, entered the room. She carried the verdict in a large manila envelope, her steps measured and deliberate. Judge Bridger, who had been watching the jury closely, nodded to the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman nodded, approaching the judge's bench. She handed the envelope to the judge, who took a moment to review it before addressing the court. Please be seated, Judge Bridger said, his voice steady. The jury has reached a verdict. The courtroom sat down in hushed anticipation, the air thick with uncertainty. Judge Bridger glanced at the envelope one last time before beginning to read aloud. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Clint Eastwood. We find that the defendant, Gerald Sterling and Sterling Development Corporation, did willfully encroach upon the plaintiff's property and did act in bad faith by ignoring repeated requests to cease construction. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's willful disregard of property law. A stunned silence followed the judge's words. Clint didn't react immediately. He simply sat still, his face as calm as ever, letting the words sink in. The court erupted in whispers, reporters scrambling to file their stories, the room buzzing with shock, disbelief, and astonishment. Gerald Sterling, on the other hand, froze, his face paling as the reality of the verdict hit him. He had lost completely a case he had once dismissed as a minor nuisance. The trial he thought he could control had turned into a public humiliation. Your Honor, Sterling's voice trembled, but he quickly regained his composure. We request an immediate stay of execution. This verdict, Judge Bridger raised a hand, cutting him off. The jury's decision is final, Mr. Sterling. Any motions for a stay or appeal will need to be filed through the proper channels. He looked at Clint, his expression unreadable. Mr. Eastwood, do you wish to make a statement before we conclude today's proceedings? Clint rose slowly, his movements measured, his calm presence seeming to command the entire room, and for a moment all eyes were on him. "I've spent a lot of time in courtrooms on screen, of course," Clint said, his voice resonating through the room. "But this time I wasn't playing a part, I wasn't acting, I was standing up for what's right." He paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling took my land, and he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could ignore the law, silence the truth, and walk away without consequence. He looked back at the jury. But the law caught up with him, and today you've ensured that justice has been served." There was a brief silence, then a murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Clint continued, his tone steady but with an unmistakable edge. "This isn't just about property, it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy, and I want to thank the jury for having the courage to do that." He turned to the judge. "No further statements, Your Honor." Judge Bridger nodded, his expression softening. "The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant is ordered to pay the full amount of damages awarded, as well as the plaintiff's legal fees. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a sharp crack, and the room erupted in noise. Reporters surged forward, eager to capture Clint's words, while Sterling's legal team scrambled to process the outcome. Clint didn't linger. He rose, nodded to the judge, and began to walk towards the exit. As he passed Sterling's table, he didn't look at him. He didn't have to. The verdict had spoken louder than any words could. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters swarmed Clint as he stepped into the sunlight, their microphones thrust towards him, their cameras flashing. But Clint simply raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He took a deep breath, his expression solemn, then looked into the nearest camera. Justice was served today, but this isn't just about one man getting what he deserved. This is about everyone who's had their land stolen, their rights ignored. Today, I'm here to say that we all deserve justice, no matter who we are. And with that, Clint Eastwood walked away, a quiet hero in his own story. The courtroom victory had been decisive, but outside the courthouse, a new battle awaited, a battle for public perception. Reporters swarmed Clint Eastwood as soon as he stepped outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust towards him, and journalists clamoring over one another, desperate for a sound bite. "Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to win against such a powerful corporation? Do you think this case sets a precedent for property ownership? Will you be taking legal action against other developers who operate like Sterling?" Clint paused on the courthouse steps, the sun casting long shadows behind him. He adjusted his hat, letting the noise die down before speaking. "Justice was served today," he said simply, his calm, firm voice cutting through the chaos. "Not because I'm Clint Eastwood, not because this case got media attention, but because the truth was on my side. And when the truth is on your side, you don't have to play dirty. You just have to stand your ground." The reporters scribbled down every word, but Clint was already moving. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. He'd come for justice, and he'd gotten it. As he walked towards his car, he spotted Michael Ollie, the construction foreman whose testimony had turned the tide of the case. Ollie stood near the edge of the crowd, looking nervous, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Clint stopped in front of him. "You did the right thing." Mr. Ollie nodded, sighing. "I wasn't sure I had the guts to do it. I've been in this business a long time, and I've seen a lot of things swept under the rug." He glanced at the reporters. "But seeing you stand there, not backing down, made me realize I didn't want to be on the wrong side of this one." Clint nodded in respect. "Took courage to do what you did." Mr. Ollie hesitated, then said, "If you ever need a builder, give me a call. It'd be nice to work for someone who doesn't cut corners." Clint gave a slight smirk. "I'll keep that in mind." Meanwhile, Gerald Sterling was still inside the courthouse, seething with anger. He sat slumped at the defense table, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. Davies, his lawyer, was already packing up his files, knowing there was nothing left to argue. "This isn't over," Sterling muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Davies sighed. "Yes, it is, Gerald." He snapped his briefcase shut. "You took a gamble, you lost." Sterling glared at him. "We're appealing." Davies shook his head. You can appeal all you want, but we both know this case wasn't just about legal technicalities. The jury saw through you. The press has turned you into a villain. You're finished. Sterling gritted his teeth, but he knew Davies was right. His reputation was in tatters. His company's stock had started plummeting the moment the verdict was announced. Investors were pulling out, and the city had hinted at reviewing his other development projects for violations. For the first time in his career, Gerald Sterling was being held accountable, and he didn't know what to do. Days later, Clint Eastwood returned to Carmel by the sea, standing on his land, the land he had fought to reclaim. The construction equipment was gone, the workers, the noise, the destruction, all cleared away by court order. The land was his once again, as pristine as it was meant to be. He took a slow breath, savoring the salty sea breeze. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a statement, an affirmation that no matter how powerful or wealthy someone was, they didn't have the right to take what wasn't theirs. As he walked along the edge of his property, he spotted a familiar face. Judge Jefferson Bridger stood by the fence, his hands tucked into his pockets. Clint approached. "Didn't expect to see you here." Bridger chuckled. "I thought I owed you a proper handshake, Mr. Eastwood. I misjudged you when that trial started." Clint studied him for a moment. "You weren't the only one." Bridger extended his hand. "Then consider this an official admission that I was wrong." Clint shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that." Bridger glanced out at the land. "So what's next for you? Planning to build something here?" Clint looked out at the rolling hills and the distant ocean. He shook his head. "No, just going to leave it as it is." The judge nodded. "Good choice." He hesitated, then added, "Not everyone would have fought the way you did. Most people would have taken the settlement and walked away." Clint gave a slight smirk. "Most people aren't me." Bridger chuckled. "That's for sure." As the judge climbed back into his car, Clint remained standing there, hands tucked into his pockets, gazing out at his land. The battle was over. The dust had settled, and he had once again proven that sometimes all it took was one man willing to stand his ground. The world would keep turning, corporations would keep trying to game the system, and men like Sterling would rise and fall. But as long as there were men willing to fight for what was right, justice would always have a chance. And Clint Eastwood had just reminded everyone of that truth. With one last look at his land, he tipped his hat and walked into his house, leaving the rest of the world to talk about the legend he had just become once again. This story is a testament to the perseverance and courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when underestimated. If you were in Clint Eastwood's position, what would you have done? Have you ever had to fight to reclaim justice for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might just inspire someone else. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with your friends and family to spread the message of integrity and fairness. Thank you for watching and for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Let's work together to create a world where truth is always honored, where every small action can make a big difference. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.